Hey everybody, welcome back. This week, John, Shannon, Amanda, and I are discussing the white-throated sparrow, which somehow is our first sparrow episode. And what a sparrow to start on. This one is super interesting. We talk about sparrows in general and how to differentiate them based on behavior and not just their appearance. We also talk about how they have been shrinking in size over the last 50 years and how the specimen collection at the Field Museum have helped determine that. We also talk about their different head types and how the different head types have a preference for who they mate with and what that means for their genetics. After that, we answer a mailbag question from a listener in the UK on vultures. Okay, go grab your binoculars and let's get into it. Welcome back, everyone. Today we're talking about the white-throated sparrow. And I think this is our first sparrow episode, isn't it? I believe.
I guess it is.
Yeah. I don't know how it's taken us this long.
Well, it's because the tree of life made it all messy because Darwin's finches could have been considered sparrows until recently, and now they're not. So we end up doing, inadvertently, we've done a lot of tanager episodes.
Yes. Yeah, we've been on a tanager roll lately.
Mm-hmm.
And they're a little more colorful than the average sparrow.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, Amanda, did you want to do the description of the white-throated sparrow just for the listeners that don't know what it looks like?
Yeah, just set a baseline. So this is a description of an adult, whether male or female. It says large, plump sparrow with long tail and fairly small bill. Has a bold face pattern with black and white crown stripes, a yellow spot between the eye and the bill, and a neat white throat patch on a gray face and breast. I wanted to just remark from my impression of this bird, I love its little white throat. It looks like a little white beard to me. So I think it's so cute. And then I'm going to play a quick song. I really like the song too.
The classic description of that is poor Tom Peabody. and it's one of my favorite things in spring when they arrive and you start hearing the birds that are moving north doing that. It's a great call.
That's awesome. I love that description. That's cool.
Anything that reminds me of summer is a good thing.
Is happy. You're right.
Yeah, so we really just kind of got into sparrows this fall, Amanda and I. It was like something that, I don't know, since we're newer, sparrows were really hard for us, obviously. And like really this fall have kind of gotten better at identifying them. Like I remember last fall we were out birding with someone and they were saying like, are you guys good at your sparrows yet? And we kind of looked at each other like almost embarrassed, like we didn't even really know aside from house sparrows. And this year really being able to identify, kind of white-throated sparrow, white crowned fox sparrows. So it's been fun seeing all of them around.
Yeah.
But is there a reason, like, I feel like this fall, maybe it's just that, is this time of year better to see them? Or, I mean, are they kind of in the spring as well?
So, yes, in the sense that a lot of the sparrows in our area, not all of them, but white-throat is one of the examples of a bird that breeds north of here. So it's a primarily northern, boreal forest breeder from high elevations in New York all the way over to Alaska, basically. And they come through in the spring and fall in big numbers, but, they get down on the ground and there are multiple species that are all brown with various different patches, as Amanda was describing earlier. And so I think they're one of the things that take a little while for people to get into without a level of frustration in terms of seeing something and wondering what it is. And for some of the species, especially in the fall, you've got young ones coming through, and so they can look different. So I think that's why sparrows are sort of not the same thing as looking at spring warblers, for instance, where, you've got the males that are all different plumages and things, and that's why it takes people a while to get used to them. But they're really just a wonderful group of birds.
You probably last spring weren't aware of how important sound was, so that
true.
You weren't using all of the tools you had at your disposal to figure out what something was. And, and that's really true. So I think what you're looking at is your guys' evolution as bird watchers.
Oh, awesome. I like that.
I mean, I'll give you a quick example from, I grew up in Arizona, and in Arizona, white-throated sparrow is a rare bird because they're mostly an East Coast or Eastern U.S. wintering bird, but they show up once in a while. And so when I went to graduate school in Louisiana, I actually learned their call note, which is different sounding, but I just hadn't heard it very often. And I went back and did a Christmas count in Arizona after I'd been spending time birding in Louisiana, and they show up occasionally. But I was literally walking in this canyon in the Catalina Mountains, and I heard this little chip note, and I suddenly my mind said, "Wait a minute, that was a white-throated sparrow."
Aww.
And I tracked it down, and it was, and it's just So it's neat that they have these differences, but unless you are around them on a regular basis, you don't pick up on it.
Mm-hmm.
And we were wondering, John, you told us about with warblers how you can identify them more on behavior also. Amanda and I were so keen on just looking for colors and everything, and then really you opened our eyes to that really behavior is a way to identify them. Are sparrows kind of that way too, where a white-throated sparrow would behave different than other sparrows?
For sure. And at the same time, I would almost argue that it's a little bit more of a. There was a friend of mine at the University of Arizona who used to give talks about this, and he called it the gestalt of what a sparrow was something you needed to get used to. And sometimes it's literally just the way they behave on the ground. And if you've seen enough white-throated sparrows, you'll see something move, and I'll say to myself, I bet that was a white-throated sparrow as opposed to a white-crowned sparrow, which can also be very common at the same time. And yet at the same time, I always look at them to make sure that I'm actually right about it.
Yeah. John, what would differentiate them that you could just look at a movement and say, oh, that's a white-throated versus a white-crowned?
So one of the things about white-throated is it's much more of a forest bird than basically any of the other sparrows. And they often go in groups. So you can see a single one, but you can also see groups of them. And so if you see a group of sparrows in Illinois that's in the forest, they're almost certainly going to be white-throats. And so there are little things like that, but then they're a little smaller than white-crowned, and white-crowned is kind of sits up and is a little bolder. And again, if you get your binoculars on them, you can really see the differences in terms of the kinds of things you were describing earlier, where white-crowned has a very plain breast and these bold white crown patches, although the immatures in the fall are brown, have brown stripes in the median crown stripes as opposed to black, which is what the adults have. So there are these things that make it tough for sure.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, you can also look at kind of how they're foraging. How do they get the stuff off the ground that they might be eating? Do they scratch the ground a bunch of times? This sparrow does do that. And that's different than some of the other things that might be confused with. Is it at your feeder? Because some birds are more likely to be at your feeder, and others, even though you see them, hundreds of them on the ground, they're never up in the air at someone's feeder, or very rarely. So there are all these things you'll learn eventually about things that can cue you into other facts about them, other than kind of what color their throat might be, which you don't always see.
Yeah, and white-throated sparrow is an interesting bird that way because depending on the time of year, they can do some different things. So in spring migration in Chicago, they'll be on the ground like Shannon's talking about. They can be underneath feeders. But then if the elm trees are going to seed, they'll be up in the elms. And so you suddenly have to restructure your mind with respect to what you're expecting when you put your binoculars on something, because you'll see some of them moving around through the elms feeding. So there's definitely some opportunism with it that varies depending on the time of year.
And then do they migrate with other sparrows, or do they kind of stick with, or all the white-throated stick together, or do sparrows kind of migrate in groups together?
So that's a really interesting question, and it's actually come up because of some of the window kill data that Dave Willard and colleagues at the Field Museum have gathered over the years. So sparrows are one of the primary birds hitting windows. And one of the things that our former student Ben Winger spearheaded a paper on was doing some analysis where they suggested that birds that have flight calls, and sparrows are one of the groups that tends to have flight calls, tend to hit the windows in greater numbers than birds that don't. And so I wouldn't call them, strongly flocking birds in the sense of Canada geese or anything. And yet at the same time, it does appear like they're listening to one another when they're migrating at night in the spring and fall through Chicago, for instance.
Yeah, and that means we have a lot of them in our collection. And this doesn't even come close to including how many we actually have. But cataloged right now, we have 11,888.
Oh, my gosh.
Wow.
Of these sparrows, of both of the head types, which we'll talk about in a minute. So that's a significant portion of our collections, right? And one species of birds almost exclusively through the window kills that are.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
That's great.
And yet one of the things I love telling visitors when they come into the museum is that what that provides is an incredibly dense sampling over a 45-year period to look at change over time. And they're one of the species that's demonstrably getting smaller as time goes on through these dense series. And, as Shannon always says, which I love, is that what's going to happen over the next 20 years as body size gets smaller in these birds like white-throated sparrow.
Yeah. Where is an inflection point? How small can you get and still migrate? So in this case, every dimension except the wings of these birds are getting smaller. Eventually, something has to break, right? Either they have to go to a different place because they can't migrate in the same way because their wings are going to get drug along with whatever's making them smaller. But the pressure to be able to still migrate is pretty great. So I'm telling stories because there's no data about this. But yeah, I wonder what's going to happen. And so many species are getting smaller over the last 40 years, which is, maybe 10 to 15 generations for these birds. And evolution in birds is not supposed to happen that quickly. Bacteria, okay. Viruses, we've seen in action over the last 5 years, just how quickly they can evolve. But birds aren't supposed to do that. And if you just said to someone that you're going to be able to see with your own eyes, without having to measure, that a bird from 100 years ago or 40 years ago and now are demonstrably different, that you could see it with your own eyes, you don't need technology or calipers to show it, people would say you're crazy. There's just no way that could happen. But it is happening, and it's happening across many, many, many species of North American birds. So we have birds declining in population size, a whole bunch of them. We have so many of them getting smaller at the same time. It's not surprising that those two things are likely related.
Yeah, and we can share, there's a really great photograph of one of the early birds from 40 plus years ago versus one of the current ones that Shannon has that shows you the difference in the bill morphology. You can literally see it in the photo.
Just from 40 years ago? Wow.
And are there some theories out there or ideas of what is driving this? Or
so the most likely culprit is literally climate change. And at the same time, because the people that have done this work, Ben Winger and Brian Weeks and folks at the University of Michigan, working with the folks in our collection at the Field Museum, they're always worried that they want to nail it down as well as they can. And so they're continuing to look at this. And that's one of the great things about having these collections is you can continue to ask questions like, could it be changes in magnetic poles or something, just something that we haven't thought about in detail. But I'd argue that from my perspective, it's pretty unlikely that this isn't a direct response to changing climates across the distribution of these birds. I just want to point out real quickly that white-throated sparrows, compared to some of the birds we've talked about in the past, are what I would call short-distance migrants, in the sense that they breed all the way up in Canada, but they winter down in places like Louisiana, and there are occasionally individuals that'll hang around year-round in the Chicago area too.
I mean, it is interesting. and they showcase them getting smaller showcases to me some fascinating things, and it gives you more questions to ask than it ever actually gives you answers. But specimens always do that. There's no end of the questions that you can ask, but the specimens will help you with the answers. So if you warm the planet, you change the relationship between your ability to maintain temperature in an environment that's getting warmer. So what we know over revolutionary timeframes, a lot longer than 40 years, is that birds that live in those kinds of environments get smaller because it helps with heat exchange to be smaller. So you have a pressure to be smaller maybe as you warm the environment, but we must be changing the environment so dramatically that can happen over very short periods of time, which is this is not normal. But the student who did this is one of John's students who used to be a Field Museum resident graduate student who's now a professor at the University of Michigan and a curator of their bird collection.
Very cool. Yeah, I was just going to say the white-throated sparrows don't have electric blankets.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I guess they don't need them. That's the thing.
Yeah. So it's correlated. There's a lot of sophisticated statistics that you can do, both on how you measure and interpret measurements and how you correlate those changes to Earth parameters that we know something about now. Temperature, rainfall, temperature on the breeding grounds, temperature on the winting grounds, maximum temperatures, minimum temperatures, average temperatures, all of those things. But the increasing temperatures in the breeding grounds of these birds are showing the strongest signal for correlations with the size getting smaller. And so that's a general phenomenon, right? We're not only warming the earth for white-throated sparrows. We're warming it for every species that lives on this planet. But there's going to be a lot of idiosyncratic responses to that, which our collections will actually help us get at, right? You have to have the material. You can't say, oh, it's 2024 going into 2025. Oh, I wish I'd have known what these birds were doing 50 years ago, because you can't go back in time. And that's what collections give you, is the ability to go back in time, understand what happened so that you can predict the future and maybe ameliorate what happens. And so these studies can only be done with Field Museum's collections across the world. We're the only people who have this kind of data, who have this many specimens. So our collections become increasingly valuable.
And circling back to what you guys were talking about identifying sparrows, is habitat plays a big role. So I was saying that white-throated sparrows they're really one of the only species that's using forest and forest edge really heavily. But as Shannon was saying, there's a lot of these other species of sparrows, which you can get used to. If you're walking around in grassland and a sparrow comes up, it's probably not going to be a white-throated sparrow. And so there's a whole set of other possibilities depending on whether you're in wetlands or whether you're in dry grass. And all these different sparrows are experiencing these aspects of climate change, as Shannon was saying, in different ways.
And have the getting smaller, has that been like a steady thing, or is it, it
looks like it. The graph suggests that it's, a pretty consistent decline since we started collecting this many of them. You can't just measure one either, right? So if someone collected one per year of window kill, that's not a sufficient sample size. You have to have enough that the statistics can show you the real patterns.
And there are additional aspects of this. So the beauty of this data set, which is why people keep working on it, is you've got spring samples and fall samples. And in the fall samples, you've got males and females, but you've also got adults and immatures. So there are 4 different classes there. And one of the questions is always, could they be responding differently in these different age classes with respect to what's going on? So the amount of natural history information that you'd like to have on these birds is substantial if you really want to understand what's going on.
And then are there the 2 different head types in the sparrows as well? Can we talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, white-throated sparrow is a very special bird in that respect.
and not just in the fact that there's two morphs, which is fairly unusual when you combine the fact that there are two morphs with what we know about their genetics at this point. So there's tan-striped and white-striped morphs, and they have very different behaviors associated with the stripe color on the head. And they've been studied for a long time. Remember when we talked about house wrens and how they were one of the most studied birds? Well, white-throated sparrows are right up there with among the most studied birds, at least in North America. And it's their behaviors and then their genomics are really, really interesting. It's really interesting because there are no subspecies described. Well, not really anyways. So they have this extremely broad distribution without having a gazillion subspecies described, which most birds have had that. If they have a distribution like that, they have a dizzying array of subspecies that have been described. But that's not true of white-throated sparrows, which is super interesting. So they have this polymorphism in the population that's, roughly 50-50. How do you have this polymorphism in a population? Yeah. It's not geographically based. So What on earth is happening? And it turns out it's super, super, super interesting what is happening. It's one of the first birds whose genomics was done, and it kind of blew everybody's mind about what these birds were actually doing on the ground, how this polymorphism is maintained. And so there's a paper in 2008 that came out that started this, looking at the genomes of these birds, try to figure out how do these different crown types get made. So it's really important for us not just to collect the bird, but to also figure out what the head type is too, right? So if you go into our collection, there's a bunch of scalps that are stapled onto cards in our collections.
Yeah. These are from window kills where we were skeletonizing the bird, and Dave Willard realized that what he thought, and he still thinks this, is that the pattern between the two morphs, they're called tan and dark morphs or black morphs, isn't as clear cut as people often imply in the literature. And so Dave wanted, because we were skeletonizing, 100 birds at a time sometimes. He would save these to as a piece of data for the future, for people to look at. And that's an interesting part of this whole question is, are there additional details that we still don't know about? I did want to point out that the work that Shannon was talking about to figure this stuff out was done by this woman named Delana Tuttle at Indiana State University. And she and her students and her husband put that together. And unfortunately, she passed away tragically right as this stuff came out. And so it's a legacy that I hope will be carried on because it's just really fascinating work.
Yeah, she died of breast cancer, and her husband and their students kind of published this paper in 2016, which is a summary of so much of the genomic work that's been done. So, there were some subspecies or some discussion of geographic variation at the beginning of bird people doing this, and they thought that maybe it was age-related or sex-related, these different head types. So you can get all kinds of weird perceptions of what's going on if you think it's age-related or sex-related, but none of those things turned out to be true. So it's not until we could apply some genomic techniques to this that we started to understand what was happening and how you could maintain this polymorphism in a population. So the earliest studies showed pretty clearly that there was what's called a genomic inversion. So what that means is that your DNA is packaged into chromosomes. Well, they go to genes, then they get into chromosomes. In humans, we have 46 chromosomes or 23 pairs of chromosomes. It turns out that white-throated sparrows have 82 chromosomes. And a lot of birds have more chromosomes than humans do. And there was an inversion in one of the chromosomes that crossed the center point of a chromosome. And what an inversion means is that it's almost like you cut it out, flipped rotated it and stick it back in. And when that happens, there's all kinds of genomic, there's things that happen with both sexual and asexual reproduction that become very interesting at that point. There's something called crossing over that happens when your cells start dividing and they pair up. And if you've had a high school biology class, you've seen these little pictures of all the chromosomes across the middle of the cell, and then them spreading to one side of the cell or the other side of the cell, and then they're a pinch in the middle, and the cells go off on their own way. And when they match themselves up along the center line, there's often pieces of DNA that's exchanged between the chromosomes, and that's called crossing over. And it's a very important way of generating variation in genomes. But in this, when you do this inversion thing, you prevent crossing over from happening, because if there is crossing over, the individual will have either more of the genes that are in that region or too few of them, and the individual can die. So what happens is that there's recombination in those regions, goes way down to preserve kind of the gene complement that are in these inverted pieces. And in this case, there are genes that actually repress recombination that are also part of this whole genomic complex in the context of this inversion. So that's a little bit of the genomics, but it gets more complicated. This is like the tiniest bit of the complication.
Oh, wow.
Well, and this is why people like Elena Tuttle needed to spend all this time working out what was going on in these white-throated sparrows. And one of the fascinating implications of all this that turns out happens at the organismal level is that in the breeding system of white-throated sparrows, birds of the different morphotypes tend to prefer mating with one another.
So you have white with tan and tan with white, but you don't have white with white and tan with tan, or not very frequently. So all of a sudden you have a system where there's an inversion that's causing things to happen, and you have disassortative mating that's happening, which means that the male prefers the female of the other type and vice versa. And that's how this polymorphism is maintained in this population, is through these varying kinds of mating things. And so when Elena Tuttle, when they describe this in the paper, it's beyond just understanding this system, because they translate it into how sex chromosomes might develop in the first place. So in humans, we have X and Y chromosomes, and and they were clearly a pair historically, but now a lot of differences have happened. Genes that are not on the Y chromosome is fairly depauperate of genes, and there's more on the X chromosome, but they're really different. And now what's happening in white-throated sparrows is kind of the same thing that's developing through this inversion and this disassortative mating. It's almost like there are 4 sexes that are happening. The male of a white, the female of a white, the male of a brown, a tan, the female of a tan. And so if you follow this through time, you may learn something about how sex chromosomes have evolved in vertebrates. So it's completely fascinating and very confusing and really kind of tricky to, even John and I were talking about this morning, just how complicated this is and how difficult it is to understand, let alone to try to describe to other people who are probably now completely confused.
Yeah.
but one of the things we should emphasize is that you can see these different morphs, the tan morph and the black morph, when you're out birding. Yeah.
You'll have them in your yard.
Really noticeable. And again, coming back to what Shannon was said, if you're not thinking about it, you would say, well, all right, the black and white could be an adult bird, and the brown and white striped birds could be immatures. And you could just pass that off, except for the fact that people have figured out all these different things about how this is working.
That's crazy.
So they're way more interesting than they look. They look like a unassuming little brown sparrow with what you said, a charming white throat and some head colors differences. But underneath the surface, it is one of the most interesting bird under its feathers.
That's awesome.
That's so cool.
It makes you wonder if we've seen all those different kinds, RJ.
Almost certainly you have. You probably didn't pay attention to it because it's really easy to think, well, the tan ones are just immature because, that immatures are often duller than adults. And so you just kind of blow it off. You don't think about it. But now every time you see one of those birds, you're going to look very closely at its head color and think to what is it mating with, all these weird things. And
oh, man. Shannon, go ahead, John.
Well, what I was going to say, so there, I think there are 4 members of the genus Zonotrichia. There's white-crowned, white-throated, terraces. What am I missing?
Rufous.
Oh, rufous collared and
white collared, golden crown, white crown, golden crown, terraces, and white throated. And
so Harris's sparrow has a black breast pattern, and they've done experiments with that where they've manipulated it, and the males have it, and males are actually, their dominance hierarchy is influenced by how black they are on their breasts.
Crazy.
And so all these different aspects of how birds are doing things can lead to funny interactions. So for instance, for years when I was looking at white-throated sparrows without knowing all these details, my thought was these brown birds were actually, basically subordinate to the more aggressive black morphs. And that turns out to not really be true.
No, I mean, there are behavioral correlations directly going along with this genomic inversion and this head color differences. So white ones are more aggressive for sure. Not because of subordinacy in the same way, because they're both getting copulation, so the brown one's not kind of just helping the white one along, but they have way more fidelity to their mate. The tan ones do. The white ones, there's way more extra-pair fertilization, so we've talked about that before. Wow. So they're getting more outside of their primary relationship, and they are very much more dominant. So their behavioral characteristics that go along with this weird genomics and these weird head color differences. This is fascinating.
That's crazy.
Yeah. I can't imagine how difficult that would be to study.
I know.
So I love it because it highlights something that, I've always admired about researchers who are able to go out and focus on a single species and really understand it well. And it highlights in some ways how, this should happen for every single species. And, that requires a lot of scientists and support for science. And we live in interesting times right now. And I hope for support for science will continue to grow at some point, if not in the next administration that we're about to have.
Right. I was going to say, Shannon, you reminded me when you were saying maybe you'd see one of the different variations of the white throat and think, oh, maybe it's just an immature. And it's so funny because that's something RJ and I have patted ourselves on the back about this year. Because in the past couple of years, we'd see what we realize now was an immature bird, and we would think it was an exotic or something. We would play oh my God, that's the weirdest robin we've ever seen, or whatever, or not even imagine it's a immature robin. We'd think it was this new crazy bird. And so we were
the immature redheaded woodpecker was the one that we saw this year that we were so proud. We're oh yeah, that's just an immature.
Yes. And
we were this looks unlike anything else that we had seen, but we knew it was immature.
Exactly. And 6 months ago we would have been we discovered a new bird.
If you grow up in the Pacific Northwest, you'll look at robins and try to turn them into varied thrushes. Same kind of thing, right? Your history and your own background makes you think of something is what it is, and you make it more different than it actually is, and then you're
Exactly.
oh, okay.
And at some point we should probably get some of the gull experts on, because in gulls sometimes it takes 3 years to 4 years to reach maturity, and so they go through these different, they call them cycles, where young birds that are 2 years old look different from birds that are 1 year old, look different from birds that are 3 years old. Yeah. So that's
gulls are kind of the holy grail of bird identification, right? So that like you need some kind of extra special discipline to learn how to tell them apart.
Oh my gosh.
If you're in a place where there are a lot of different species. And it turns out that there's a lot of hidden genomic variation in gulls and a lot of undescribed species potentially. So it gets even more complicated. But the interesting thing about, I think, not just about population declines and not just about physical getting smaller in this bird, and that is its winter range is delimited by precipitation and the temperatures, the middle temperatures, the minimum temperatures, in January. So what happens to that bird as we warm the earth? Not just that it's going to get smaller and what happens there, but where is it going to be in the next 50 years?
Yeah, so the general trend in the simple studies, we have some tools that can do interesting things about monitoring how climate's going to change across North America. And people can go and look at Audubon Society summaries of some of this. And when they run models for the wintering ranges of birds like white-throated sparrow, a lot of times they'll be predicted to start moving further north, that the birds will actually, but the question is that going to be an effective strategy for some of these species to find habitat that's suitable for them to survive the winters? And with white-throated sparrow, I would say it's not a species of great concern, because it's a really successful bird with high population numbers. But all those questions become really possible to monitor with some of the tools we've got over time.
What happens if its range in the winter changes and it has a very strong competitor that it doesn't have now in its range, right? We don't know.
Okay.
So we can't just assume that something's numerous now. I'll say the word passenger pigeon and think that it's always going to be that way. Passenger pigeons were thought to be the most common bird in the world, with over 3 billion individuals. And within 20 years after that, thinking it was extinct or close to extinct, on its way to extinction. So you can't use current things to, say for certain what's going to happen. That's why we study them, right? We need to understand the parameters that go into either population increases or decreases. And and they're also, getting back to white-throated sparrows, the morphs have different brain morphology, so it affects the neuroanatomy, not the color per se, but the behavioral aspects, the aggression and things like that have resulted in or result from, I don't know how that works, from anatomical changes in the brains of these birds too. So that's really interesting to me. And then, hey, John, maybe you know this, the other factoid that I saw, and is this true, that they sing from the left side of their syrinx only?
There's a factoid I didn't know the answer to.
That's cool.
Well, I think we getting kind of close on time. Is there anything else on white-throated sparrow we want to talk about?
You'll never look at your yard the same way. What do you think, Amanda?
Yeah. I was just gonna ask. I keep on thinking what you guys, Shannon, what you were saying about how the ones with the white markings, they prefer, is it tan mates? Is that correct? And then is it vice versa, or what's the other one? Yeah. What would that be the science behind that? Why would you be interested in that as a?
Well, that goes along with this inversion, right? So the chromosomes are on their way to making 4 different sexes, essentially. So something in your genes in that region or make your mate choice be the opposite head color that you have. That's the only way that's the only way these different head types could be maintained at roughly 50-50 in populations. Is crazy. If that these inversions, these genomic changes are matching the behavioral mate choice.
If your selection, selection, that's crazy. That
it is nuts.
Yeah,
I agree.
Yeah.
Man.
I saw, do they hybridize with juncos?
Apparently they do, yeah.
Yeah.
They have, not very often, but juncos are fairly closely related to the genus Zonotrichia, even though they're put in a different genus.
But that doesn't mean it's normal for birds to hybridize with things outside of the genus that they're in. So it is pretty interesting.
And we should talk about juncos at some point, because there's another sparrow that is common around here that people love because they see them.
Yeah.
And they have some really fascinating aspects to their biogeography and natural history too.
And they're cuter in the West, I have to say. Just a fact.
We love juncos. I would love to talk about them. That's so cool. Wait, so they're a sparrow?
Yep.
Oh gosh. Come on.
See, sparrows are cool.
Yes. That's so funny. Oh man.
All right. Well, we have a mailbag question. Should we get into that?
Sure.
Okay. So this is somebody writing to us from England. So this is exciting. He says, "Hello, my name is Scott. I'm 33 from Manchester, England. I have a massive passion for birds and absolutely love your podcast. I have a massive love for vultures and raising awareness for conservation of these amazing birds, and think it would make a great episode to talk about vultures/condors. Hope you're all well. Keep up the good work. Much love, Scott."
So awesome.
That was exciting. Yeah.
So just on a trivial point, Scott is defined as a twitcher in British terms. So that's what the British call birders.
Oh.
I'm just
awesome.
So it's
I
nice
didn't know
to be
that.
connecting up with the twitchers in the UK.
That's awesome.
But the question about vultures is a terrific one. They're an amazing group of birds. These birds that have evolved to be scavengers, and we should definitely talk about them. There's actually two types of vultures in a phylogenetic sense. So the New World vultures and the Old World vultures are completely unrelated to one another. And that's something that's been really fun to talk about. So he mentioned condors and vultures, but that would be New World vultures in the sense of a phylogeny. And then there's a whole group of vultures in the Old World, which would also be worth talking about. And they've actually been subject to some severe population declines because of chemical usage, actually.
And to make it more complicated, so those Old World vultures are in with hawks. But all of the Old World vultures are not all each other's closest relatives either. So that scavenging phenotype, the things that go along with that, loss of feathers on your head, has evolved multiple times across that group of birds. So we definitely should talk about them, because there's all kinds of bizarre things that vultures do and that they're used for. Humans using vultures for some pretty important things, actually. So yeah, we should definitely talk about vultures.
Shannon, I remember you sent us that really interesting study on, I think it was in India. Where a population of vultures do they go extinct, basically? And it basically had an impact on humans, and humans were, their deaths were actually correlated with where the population declined on vultures, I think.
Yeah,
or something
you've
like
got to get rid of the pathogens that are going to kill people, and vultures do that, right? Their scavenging gets rid of some of the stuff that could get into people and make them sick. So yeah, there are lots of things to talk about associated with vultures. They're not just, there are lots of pictures of them that are gross, right? Because they stick their head into dead things. But they have a lot of cool adaptations.
It's awesome. That'll be fun. Yeah.
Yeah.
Good idea, Scott.
Yep, definitely.
Yeah.
All right. Well, John, Shannon, do you want to close it out on this one? Either one of you?
Shannon, you want to, or?
Beauty is skin deep. So you need to look under the hood if you want to know what is actually happening.
Thanks everyone for joining us this week. We appreciate all of you for listening. Check out our socials on Instagram, TikTok, and we are excited to announce that we are now on Blue Sky Social as well. If you have a question for us, you can reach us at podcast.birdsofafeather@gmail.com. Okay, love you all. See you next week.